Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hello, listeners. Exciting guest this week. We have Dr. Varina Michaels, who is an inclusive leader, international speaker, and published academic. Dr. Michaels is the founder and director of Paisley Group and executive director of Women of Color Australia, a leading nonprofit that advocates, supports, and strengthens the lives and experiences of women of color in all places and spaces, with a particular focus on the workplace. Varina, I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Hi, Julie. It's my pleasure to be here, coming to you from the Camaragal lands of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Australia. And I would like to acknowledge the Camaragal people and the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands that I am on and upon which Women of Colour Australia is situated. I pay our respects to their elders, past and present. I acknowledge and honour the strength and resilience of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women with whom we stand in solidarity. I acknowledge that as settlers on this stolen Aboriginal land, I am the beneficiary of the dispossession, genocide, and ongoing colonial violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We believe it is our collective responsibility and moral imperative to help dismantle the systemic barriers and structural inequities oppressing the original inhabitants of this land. We're also painfully aware that this land was taken forcibly without a treaty or reparations made. We've taken the practical step towards honouring sovereignty by paying the rent, and we invite you to do so too. This land is and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. This acknowledgement of country is a standard cultural and business practice in Australia, everywhere from politicians at Parliament House to toddlers in daycare centres, which all adapt a version appropriate for their context. And I've found that my audiences all over the world appreciate the way that it grounds us into history. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures in Australia are the oldest continuing cultures in the world, over 65,000 years old. So we can't understand where we are and where we want to be without understanding what came before us. And what that means to me is that if we want to dismantle systemic barriers and create spaces where individuals are not marginalised and not discriminated against, and get equal access to opportunities, well, we need to understand how those barriers were put into place, the development of our cultures and structures over time, and acknowledge when we benefit from these structures, not just when we're marginalised by them.
Oh my gosh, that was powerful. Thanks for that acknowledgement. What talk about like land acknowledgements, or something here in the United States where I'm based, that I think people do it, but they don't do it in a meaningful way. It's definitely not something that's been actively demonstrated on a regular basis. And if it is, it's very short. So I really appreciate all of the legs to that. That felt really powerful, and it really helped a lot of times the people that have been erased by history, help them be seen in today. So thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Michaels. So tell us about your involvement. You've done a bunch of research and you have some amazing tools, especially to help women of color in Australia and globally. I'd love to learn more about what led you down your career path to this work and how you got into it.
Beautiful. Well, I've been in international business for almost 20 years. In 2012, I founded Paisley Group, which is my global consulting firm. And at the same time, I started teaching intercultural communication and management to international students, primarily coming from the US, universities like Purdue, UC Davis, and Arizona State University. And I developed a passion for teaching people about why it is the way that we think and behave differently, and what the historical, social, and institutional factors are that reinforce these norms. In university and leadership education, I come into classrooms and get adults from those starting out their management careers to experienced master's level students through to senior executives to take a look at themselves in the mirror and ask why. Why are there things we take for granted or treat as normal, true, and correct? Where do these things come from? And can we learn to see things from another perspective? Add in my PhD, in which I learned to design, gather, and analyze both qualitative and quantitative social and psychological data. And after years of developing deep expertise, I completed my thesis studying the intersectional identities of expatriates. This experience led me to my passion, the diversity and inclusion work that I do today. I talk to people about change, about the systems, processes, and institutions that reinforce the patriarchal and colonialist views of work, of leadership. And then I get to start unpicking these structures and cultures in systemic ways, connecting ELTs and executives with employees on the front lines and their communities that their organizations serve. In my thesis, my research found that when we're completely disembedded from one context and then try to re-embed ourselves in a new context as an expatriate, we go through a process of reevaluating our identities. We don't change who we are at our core, but what these identities mean, how we enact them, does change. And a marginalized identity in one context can be a source of power in another. Because we have multiple identities, we can exist on axes of both privilege and marginalization. I'll give you an example. For me, I identify with marginalized groups. I'm a woman of color, born to 2 migrant parents, I'm neurodivergent, and I'm the primary carer of 3 small children. But I'm also hetero, able-bodied, a scholar with a doctorate. I'm incredibly lucky to be living in a Western society with a strong social security system. I have access to healthcare, education, a loving home. These are all elements of incredible privilege. So, as an advocate in the diversity and inclusion space, it's about amplifying the voices of those who are less privileged, of listening to their experiences and then working alongside communities to do something about it. I take it as my absolute honor and duty to take the privilege and power that I have and use it to better the lives of others. But that doesn't mean I always know best. Authentic engagement with communities needs to come at the forefront of this work. For example, I've published work on LGBTIQ+ intersectionality, most recently in a book chapter on global rainbow families, which came out this year. And I enjoy collaborating with other experts who have a lived experience and come from the LGBTIQ+ community. Shout out to 2 of my co-authors, the amazing Mark Butler and George Tam. And as James Charlton, one of the leaders in international disability rights in the 1990s, called his book, "Nothing About Us Without Us." So I've had some pretty horrific experiences in the workplace and beyond, from not fitting in through to seeing outright discrimination and harassment. I found a really beautiful sense of belonging and solidarity when I started volunteering with Women of Colour Australia. And I get to put my passion and my PhD and extensive work experience to great use. In my work with Women of Colour Australia, I get to ask people what the taken for granted assumptions are about what a good worker or leader looks like. Who gets access to opportunities for employment, feedback, promotions? To question if your experience of work might not be reflective of someone else's experience of work. And educate on how we can provide more equitable access to opportunities to work. And this leads me to speak and consult around the world. And then I get to drive first-hand research on how these experiences differ.
Yeah, what a great explanation of allyship in your own personal story. And I want to dig into the research you were referencing, Verena. What is the current state of, and I know specifically women of color, but if you maybe had to start with like diversity in general at a high level and then drill into the experiences of women of color, I'd love to know what you're learning from your research.
Yes, there's a lot to dive into. I'd love to talk about the Women of Colour piece in particular. Obviously, I've been an active volunteer and now I sit on the board for Women of Colour Australia, which is a leading not-for-profit that advocates for, supports and strengthens the lives and experiences of women of colour through advocacy, community support initiatives, research, and also leadership and mentor programs. Our latest research report on women of colour in the workplace will be coming out at the end of the year. But in our last report and published academic article, we unveiled that the experience of women of colour across Australia, the UK, and the US is strikingly similar. Over 60% of women of colour experience discrimination, and many more experience microaggressions. And I think what's really interesting is the intersectional lens. Just the term women of colour is incredibly inclusive. Women of colour, and we use the Loretta Ross's definition, it's a solidarity definition, not a biological designation. It's a commitment to work in collaboration with other oppressed women of colour who have been minoritised. Many women of colour from our community identify as part of the LGBTIQ plus community, including non-binary individuals. In our survey, our participants identified that their heritage was from over 60 different countries. So once we use an intersectional lens, we stop dropping people into these big boxes or categories like male, female, and we start seeing the parts of individuals which influence their unique experience. No two experiences are alike, but what we can see is that certain factors like gender and ethnicity have a historical legacy of being marginalized, have structural barriers to opportunities across society and in the workplace. And we spend 80% of our waking lives at work. Education and work are key to economic security and can be a great equalizer. In education, well, there's a lot of work to do there, but the barriers in the workplace still impact women of colour who are highly qualified and highly educated. In society, we do advocacy work with government submissions, consulting to community-based organisations and political bodies, but most of our focus is on the workplace. And when you get highly educated, qualified and talented individuals who consistently face barriers to promotion, to development, to opportunities, they get excluded, their careers stagnate, they can't break through that concrete ceiling. As one of our survey respondents wrote, organisations are still struggling with diversity on gender. The push towards gender diversity has allowed women to enter into professional roles. However, there is still a gap in terms of providing them with a nurturing environment to grow their careers. Many organisations are still male-dominated at the executive levels, and in certain industries, it's a huge challenge for women to have a voice. You can only imagine the challenges faced by women of colour, minorities in such organisations.
Yeah. Yeah, the intersectional piece, right? Like if we can't even figure out gender, how are you supposed to layer in race and gender at the same time? It's like people's heads just can't handle the complexity, which is sad. I wonder, Dr. Michaels, if you could make maybe 3 wishes for women of color, what would you hope the workplace could do more of to support them?
Good question. I think my wishes would be more around a desired end state where women of color and, in fact, all people could come to the workplace and feel seen, feel heard, feel valued, and feel appreciated. To not come across systemic barriers that hold them back and stop them from being able to fully contribute, and for organizations to be more supportive. But of course, we're a long, long way from that. Research says that we're over 250 years away from just getting gender parity in pay. So if we add an intersectional lens, and we're talking about people from, different ethnic backgrounds or disabled people or LGBTIQ plus individuals or Indigenous people, then those statistics are much, much worse. And change does take time. So I think it would be great to wish it all away, but unfortunately we're here, and so we're putting in the work instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and with that in mind, that wish of everyone to feel seen, heard, and belong at all places at work. What do you think, as far as the research goes, like research-backed strategies or future trends that you're seeing that are being successful to that extent?
Yeah, I think in terms of trends, it's almost like the more we hear about diversity and inclusion, the more people think the job is done. There's a lot of talk out there, but how many organizations are really integrating diversity and inclusion into their strategy and shifting their systems, processes, and cultures? And it's here we need data, and the data doesn't lie. So, as I said, it's going to take us 250 years until women earn the same as men in organizations. And at the moment, we live in this age of access to information in ways that we've never known before. But with all that data out there, ChatGPT, AI, thousands of years of research and development, we forget the importance of the quality of that data. So how we ask questions matters, who answers the questions matters, and how we interpret those answers matters. And these are all parts of getting high quality data. So when I work with large multinational firms or community-based organizations, we start with the questions: who are the communities that you serve, in which your employees, customers, and other stakeholders are embedded? And then I ask, what are their needs and how do we know? From there, we start to develop a community engagement strategy, because you really can't get good quality data without community engagement. You might get hundreds of thousands of responses to your survey, but if you don't ask the right questions, your conclusions will be meaningless. So how are the people that you want to know about interpreting your questions? And to quote Mats Alverson, who's one of the most influential minds in social research right now, he says, all surveys measure is box-ticking behavior of a person on a particular day and in a particular context. And what he means by this is that if the same person takes the same survey in different conditions, you'll get different answers. So how reliable are surveys? Well, it depends on the intentionality in the design and how well you know and have engaged the community that you're doing research on, or in my case, with. I think our latest Women of Colour in the Workplace survey is a great example of this. We used a co-creation framework for this survey. And when I say co-creation, it means engaging with your communities directly in 3 major areas. 1, scoping out the research. Is this area even something important and pressing? Do we need more data in this area? Or should we spend our time somewhere else? 2, in designing the research. Are these questions phrased in culturally appropriate and sensitive ways? Do your respondents interpret these questions in the ways that you mean them? What could we be asking to get at the same issue in a more accessible way? And then 3, validating the results and how we present our research. Did we make maximum impact with your time? And did we treat your stories, which is what data ultimately is, respectfully and accurately represent you? And so we did have women of colour through that process say, I don't see myself in these questions. Or instead of asking like this, it makes more sense to ask like that. And in doing this, we had some really surprising and interesting results. I'd love to come back on the podcast in the future to discuss once we publish the results of our latest survey at the end of the year. But let's just say that some of the conventional wisdom about what some of the typical terminology we see in newspaper articles or used by experts and academics alike don't bear the same outcomes when we're talking to marginalized communities, in this case, women of colour. It's like the classic example of crash test dummies being modelled on the average man. It means that when women are involved in a car accident, they're 47% more likely to suffer a significant injury and 17% more likely to die. And so workplaces are modelled on the average size gender, white, able-bodied man. And when you don't fit that model, you're more likely to face harm. When you might think of promotion as title and money, for marginalised individuals, it might be about having economic security and validating your professional identity. When you might think that women of colour should develop a thicker skin, for them, it might be about getting to a place where they feel like they don't have to justify their existence or change integral parts of who they are just to be afforded the same opportunities as anyone else. Again, in the words of one of our survey respondents, when we asked the question, what are the 3 things that would help you overcome barriers in your professional life? This respondent said, 1, let the work speak and not my colour, race, gender. 2, let the work speak and not my colour, race, gender. 3, let the work speak and not my colour, race, gender. So with surveys, we often get the what, but not the why. And in our case, we had really thick, rich descriptive data, words directly from women of color talking about their experiences, explaining their responses, and adding contextual detail in ways that are almost unheard of in quantitative survey research. So I think when I'm thinking about trends, there's only so much you can do with a survey, and I get it. Surveys are easier, they're cheaper to administer, they can reach more people. But if we take just one variable, culture, many people don't know how to tick just one cultural box in a survey. We've been conditioned in some ways. So in my case, I might tick the Asian box, but that's not really reflective of how I see myself or my experiences. It's just one aspect of my cultural identity. And of course, it depends how far you want to go back. So if I was to be asked that question, do I choose my mother's background? She migrated here as a child from England. Or my father's background, he was born and raised in India, but had a mixed cultural heritage. He's part Indian, part Portuguese, part English. And if you go back far enough, one branch of my family traces back to Angola in Africa. So which box should I tick? And again, my father's Indian, but of Catholic background, not Hindu. And I often get asked why, if I'm Indian, I don't celebrate all the Hindu festivals. So culture is really complex, and measuring it is even more difficult. It's why I did a longitudinal design in my PhD thesis to show changes over time and context, and why we've adopted longitudinal design with our biannual Women of Colour in the Workplace survey. There are some people that are doing surveys, and particularly diversity surveys, really well. The best technology facilitated tool that I've seen is a survey called the Diversity Atlas, run by a friend of mine, Peter Misfaridis, which measures cultural diversity around heritage, country of birth, language, and worldview religion. And it gives each person thousands of options to choose from in an easily accessible way. You don't have to filter through thousands of different boxes, don't worry. And then compares diversity indexes across regions, industries, and uses really large data set, which spans across the globe. But when I see organizations asking people to fill out a one-page survey about diversity, that's like just dipping your toe in the water. Your survey might find out that the water is cold, but it doesn't tell you if that's just that particular spot, or maybe on the day you gave the survey, the weather was really hot outside, which made the water seem cold. In summary, you're using data which is virtually useless. And then people often come to me and say, Dr. Michaels, we did this survey, we've tried to implement a range of things and nothing is working. Can you help us, please? And I always go back and say, of course, but we have to go back to basics. And when it comes to diversity inclusion, what are you trying to achieve? Is this aligned with your organization's strategy? And then we come back full circle to my questions from before. Who are your communities? What are their needs? And how do you know? So I really don't do data for the sake of data. We want it because it answers a fundamental question that we need to answer, and critically, that we're ready to do something about. And it's this expertise in community engagement, data and strategy, which is the reason why I've worked for many US-based organizations, either with their leaders directly or for multinational organizations and consultancies as their representative outside of the US that brings a more global lens. And technology is really incredible. I recently spoke at a global diversity and inclusion event, and my words in real time were translated into the home languages across Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and the Middle East, which is really wild. So again, we need to be really intentional. Who are our communities, in this case, employees for a multinational firm, and how do we reach them?
Yeah, that's so cool, Varina. Really interesting. Yeah, I can just see that presentation and how it would land so much better in someone's native language, real time. That's so cool. And all of the inclusive research design pieces, I mean, just the thoughtful questions you ask about the questions before asking the actual questions. And I love the analogy of the water. Is it a hot day? Is it a cold day? Right? I mean, that's the workplace. You just gonna have a really bad day, and that might not be like reflective of your tenure at an organization. So it's really important that we have context, especially of people's complexity of their identities in research design. So I know you've given us some great questions to to think about when we're pulling data, and not just pulling those sound bites that get people's attention. Just wrapping up our time together today, Dr. Michaels, knowing that your next study will be coming out later this year, I'd love for listeners just to know how to follow your work and stay connected with you.
Absolutely, I would love that. You can reach out to me directly via LinkedIn. Of course, you could go to my website, pacelygroup.com.au, or you can follow us directly at Women of Colour Australia, womenofcolour.org.au. We publish all our research, is publicly available and accessible. We think it's really important that we don't just do research, we make sure that other people can use it, that the insights really go towards change and the way that people are looking at organizations. So please reach out and connect with me. I would love that. And of course, if you have any questions around data that you're trying to gather, or you're thinking about the questions behind the questions, then more than happy to provide guidance there as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being on the Diversity Pivot podcast.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.
Appreciate it. It's been a blast.